Okay, so I titled this Sustainable Agriculture Rooted in Soil Health. Start with some classical scientists and some of the things they had to say. So soil management is not just about increasing yield and trying to maximize yield. As long ago said that to be a successful farmer, one must know the nature of the soil. Also, a physician should know something about soil, where a patient's food comes from. So one way to get to know something about your local soil, or let's say perhaps you're considering purchasing a farm or farmland or renting farmland, a good place to start is with Web Soil Survey. This is from a website from the USDA, NRCS, and you can also get it as an app on your phone. And the thing that's so neat about it, onto that land, and it can tell you the name of the soil, and then you can click on it and it will open up and show you the soil profile and the physical condition of that soil, its drainage properties, its susceptibility to flooding, and so on. So it can tell you a great deal about the soil, but it cannot necessarily tell you that much about the soil fertility. That we'll have to learn about from soil testing. So I want to just introduce the topic of soil health first. And so when we're talking about healthy soils, we really mean the ability of a soil to function. And as I already pointed out with Web Soil Survey, there are very different soils out there. They have very different properties. And so when we're talking about the ability of a soil to function, we're talking about the ability of that particular soil to function, because they do each have unique properties. For example, a very sandy soil doesn't function like a soil that's high in clay content, or shallow soil won't function as well as a deeply well-drained soil. So, but whatever the soil is, and the soil that you have on your farm, we want to do as much as possible to enhance the biological, chemical, and physical properties of the soils, and where they all come together in the best possible combination for the soil that you have on your farm, then that is the soil health that we want to achieve. I know that you heard a couple of presentations already from the USDA NRCS, and I just want to remind you that they have some very good resources with respect to soil health. They can provide a lot of assistance with regard to building soil health, and you can just look it up on their website and so on. And they can provide technical assistance. They can evaluate your present soil conditions, and they can even help you identify the possibility of toxic substances on the land. They have the ability to test for soil lead and so on. And before I would purchase farmland, I would want to know as much as possible about the soil conditions. I would like to know about the history of the soil. Was it an old orchard site, or was there something done on that site? Like in the olden days, they used something called lead arsenate as a pesticide. And if that was used, it's a permanent soil contaminant and it would still be there. And I would want to know about that. I would have the soil tested before purchasing farmland, just to be sure that it was not contaminated with toxic metals. So here's one final slide from the USDA NRCS and about their helpful ways of to achieve soil health. And you can go there and explore that on your own. All right, in my title, I mentioned sustainability or sustainable agriculture, and I want to begin to define that. And it reminds me of a book. It's a classic book that was published over a century ago. And in this book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, it never really says sustainable agriculture. Instead, it used the word permanent agriculture in China, Korea, and Japan. What brings us to mind in terms of sustainability is that, well, if you manage soils well, you can farm them essentially forever. And so there was a soil scientist from the USDA, his name is F.H. King, who at the turn of the last century was very concerned about what was happening in America and that soils were eroding or degrading or losing fertility. And he wondered, how was it possible that over in Asia, they were farming soils for centuries and centuries in a permanent way or sustainable way? And what they did was they recycled all of their resources very effectively back to the soil. And they practiced something that became known as the rule of return. So if crops or residues are taken from the land, they're composted and returned back to the land. All types of natural waste materials were returned to the land to restore soil organic matter content and resupply the minerals that were harvested and taken away from that land. And so it's just an ecological cycle that can be perpetually done to sustain soil fertility and soil health. Now, let me define sustainable agriculture, and I'm going to use a formal definition that was put forth by the American Society of Agronomy as far back as 1988. And this definition has withstood time, and so it's really kind of a sustainable definition if you think of it that way. So a sustainable agriculture is one that over the long term enhances environmental quality and the resource base on which agriculture depends. It provides for basic human food, fiber needs, is economically viable, enhances the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. And in the article where this was published, it goes on further and points out that there's three pillars of the sustainable agriculture: the economic aspect, the environmental aspect, and public welfare. And this means that it brings into the social aspects as well. So when we're talking about economics, it means that the farm can be profitable for the long term. There's social justice, social welfare. Environmental means protecting our natural resources, and public welfare is also about food quality. We want to produce foods of exceptional quality because as a farmer, think about it, it's not just your job to produce food. You're actually producing healthy humans that consume that food, and that it's whole food, it's nutrient-rich food that leads to human health. And it also minimizes exposure to toxic substances. We want to minimize the use of pesticides. We want to protect the soil from heavy metals and any other kind of toxic substances. And now we're even hearing about plastic pollution in soils. I'll get back to that towards the end. So we want to integrate all of those together in a long-term time dimension. So here's some of the practices that are associated with sustainability. Biological diversity. So we want to avoid monocultures and ideally integrate crops along with livestock on the same farm. That's not always possible, but it is really an ideal ecological way about farming. We want to rotate our crops. We don't want to grow the same crop over and over again, unless it's a perennial and, like, let's say you're establishing an orchard, that could be there for decades. Animal integration, sometimes livestock and animals are viewed in a negative light, but really they add a lot to soils and help to build soil health. And I'll come back to that point and show how it does, having especially a pasture-based livestock system on a farm is a great way to build soil organic matter, soil fertility, and soil health. We have to think of soil as a biological system and not think just about as a physical matrix filled with chemicals. We want to have a knowledge-based farming system. So if you think about farming in one way, that it uses many things that are supplied by nature, and many of these things are free. Well, perhaps you had to buy the farm, but now that you have the farm, think about it. Okay, you've got land. That's part of a natural resource. You have air, you have sunlight, you have natural rainfall, and then you have living organisms in the soil, on the soil, growing in the soil. And these are biological organisms that reproduce. So most of the things that you have there on that farm are, in a sense, gifts from nature. They are natural resources. But what you need to do, and this is why it's knowledge-based farming, you need to use your talents, your knowledge to manage these resources in a way. And one way to think about it is kind of like a musician or the conductor of an orchestra. You got many things going on the farm, all these different natural resources. And what you need to do is orchestrate it to create like a concert, to make that farm function like a living entity. One thing to keep in mind in terms of a farm is that you should work with a system that you can manage at a human scale. If it gets too big and you can't make contact with all of the land, you can't get around to make observations, well, that can lead to problems and flaws and some of the things that you've already heard about. I like to minimize the purchase of non-renewable resources. There are ways that you can get a lot of your nutrients for your farm to build soil fertility from non-commercial nutrient sources. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, I think it's very good to emphasize perennial crops as opposed to annual crops. Annual crops are something that you plant as a seed every growing season. In a way, perennials are more sustainable. They help to hold soil together permanently. They keep roots in the soil. They help to build soil organic matter. They don't require tillage. And so to the extent that you can include perennials into your farming system, that's a very good thing. And all of these that we just talked about, they're related to soil health. So over at the Rodale Institute, they have a farming systems trial comparing organic systems to chemical-based farming systems. So that man, they're holding soils. It's actually the same soil, but under different management. So where they're using manures and compost and good crop rotations, that takes that soil and makes it loose and friable and rich in organic matter, rich in biological activity. And all of this helps to accept water into the soil, reduces runoff, reduces compaction, and you got a nice stable soil. And it also is going to produce healthier crops that can avoid the use of pesticides for the most part. So soil quality, that's sometimes used interchangeably with soil health. It is the capacity of a living soil to function, to promote plant, animal, and human health. And it's really synonymous with soil health. Plant health and soil health are synonymous, and some would add that it's synonymous with human health. So to have a healthy soil, it means having an abundance of living organisms in the soil. So just one example shown here is mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza is a fungal living system with a network of hyphae that reach far into the soil, and it's a system of collecting nutrients that extends beyond the root system that can help to bring nutrients, especially phosphorus and zinc, but also even nitrogen to some extent, and water to plant roots. So it makes crops more resilient. But if you do tillage to the soil, it breaks this up and it's very destructive. But also some pesticides can be destructive of this mycorrhiza as well. So usually you don't have to add or inoculate the soil with mycorrhiza. Maybe sometimes there are commercial inoculants, but it's a matter of just not doing something to the soil that would destroy it. Things that destroy it are flooding, tillage, some pesticides. So at Rutgers, we have a professor, Dr. Jim White, who's made a fascinating discovery that he calls the rhizophagy cycle. And I'll just introduce the topic here, and then you can look this up and web search for the rhizophagy cycle to learn more about it. There's some really nice YouTubes out there about it. But really, what this phenomenon is, and this is a relatively new development or a understanding about plant roots and how plants grow, is that they utilize microorganisms, especially bacteria, that enter through the root tip or the root cap, and they travel up the root a bit, and then they're partly digested. And in that process of being digested, they bring along with them from the outside the root to inside the root, and some of this enhances plant growth. That's one way that plants acquire nutrients. The other thing that happens is that they exit the root, and in the process of going out the root, they help to create root hairs. So this then extends the root system, gives it more surface area and so on. But these microbes then exit the root through the root hairs, and then they can go back and continue the cycle of growth. So this is a fascinating thing, and it is definitely related to soil health, and it was not really known about or appreciated to how biologically active soils are until this discovery. So I want to talk about soil fertility a bit, and this is really my specialty, soil fertility. That's what I do at Rutgers. I'm an extension specialist in soil fertility. And one of the reasons it is so important to enhance and optimize soil fertility is because it is one of the things that you can have so much control over. It is one of the controllable production inputs. This is something you can do and change. Now, I already talked about some of the inherent soil properties, like, for example, soil texture. Soil texture refers to percent sand, silt, and clay. Well, it is what it is. That Web Soil Survey can tell you about the texture of the soil, but that's not something that you can easily change. It is what it is, and you need to know about it so that you can manage it well, but it's not something you can change. On the other hand, soil fertility, if it's soil pH, or if it's the supply of phosphorus or potassium or micronutrients, if any of them are lacking, they can be added to the soil and correct that deficiency. And so soil fertility, when well managed, should never be a crop yield limiting factor. So this is where you want to use your knowledge about soil fertility or doing a soil test so that you can supply the essential minerals, and you do it in a way that also builds soil health and profitability. Now, there's some other things too that are important, like plant variety or plant breeding or genetics and cultural practices. They're all important too, and they account for perhaps the other half of what has allowed modern agriculture to increase production. But soil fertility was a big one, and it should never be neglected. So here's an important principle of soil fertility. So you want to have a balance of all essential nutrients, or a balance of every essential factor of crop production. So it's not just nutrients, but it could be temperature, sunlight, water, whatever it is. Whatever is the most limiting factor, focus on that first, correct that, and then ask the question, what is the next most limiting factor, and so on. But anyway, if it is a plant nutrient, this is something that you can identify and correct and eliminate that as a crop yield limiting factor. And then there's the opposite kind of to the law of the minimum, the so-called law of the minimum. There's the law of the, what this means is that it's possible to have way too much of something or an excess of something, and that can also limit yield. And so it just creates a terrible imbalance. And the problem though with an excess, if it's a nutrient, it's not easily taken out in the short term. But at least if you have knowledge of something that is in an excess, you can stop adding it. And so that's another reason to do a soil test. If you, for example, find that you have extremely high phosphorus, we'll stop adding it. All right. Now, there's another important economic principle of soil fertility, or really this goes beyond soil fertility. This is a principle of economics in general, but oftentimes they will use like an application of nitrogen fertilizer to illustrate this principle that's called the law of diminishing marginal returns. And you see it here graphically, like initially there's a strong increase in productivity, and then it begins to taper off and round off. And then when you get to extremely high application rates of fertilizer, it can actually have a negative effect. But even before you get to a negative effect, there's this point of diminishing returns. And so fertilizers are expensive, especially modern fertilizers today. They're very, very expensive in today's world with high inflation. And so what you have to factor in is the cost of that fertilizer input, and think about where will that last unit of fertilizer that you apply, where will it at least still pay for the increase in yield? So will that increase in yield pay for that last unit of input? And so there is a diminishing amount of yield output. And so you want to back off and not try to achieve maximum yield, but it's something less than maximum yield. And related to the law of the minimum that I mentioned earlier, you want a balance. You want a balance of the various essential plant nutrients. So you have to think about this in a way like supply and demand. And the way I have this in two columns is that, okay, think about what are the factors that influence demand. So demand is a function of the crop species. Some crop species, corn as an example, or hay, these are crops that are very, very nutrient demanding. Also, the higher the plant population, the intensity of production, this increases demand for nutrient uptake. Also, it varies over the course of the growing season, the growth stage of the crop, the physiology of the crop, the weather, These are things that can influence the growth of the crop and the demand for nutrients. And so this can vary over the course of the growing season. Another factor is, how is that crop harvested? Are you just taking a part of the plant, or are you harvesting the whole above ground part of the plant? Well, if you remove the entire biomass, as is done for hay production, or if you're just taking off grain, well, that's a very different kind of harvest, and that removes a big difference in the amount of nutrients that are actually pulled out of the soil and off the land. So now let's look at the supply factors. So we have to think about, well, what is the soil type? And you can learn about your soil type from Web Soil Survey. Another thing you can do is simply dig a hole on your land and observe the soil properties. Take a note of the texture of the soil. You can learn about the texture of the soil by taking it into your hands and feeling that soil and feeling for sand particles or clay particles. How does it feel? And if it's moist, can you work it into like a ribbon? Is it something that you can mold, or is it very, very sandy and it simply just falls apart? So texture has a lot to do with supplying nutrients. Very sandy soils are not very good at supplying nutrients, and they tend to become exhausted pretty quickly. But fine textured soils and loamy textured soils are good at having resilience and supplying nutrients over a longer period of time. They're not as easily exhausted. Temperature and weather and microbial activity all come into play because this influences the biology of the soil. Very dry soils, low biological activities, but warm, moist soils, the microbes get very active, and they help to break down organic matter, which stores nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus and releases these nutrients for plants. And then the farming practice, like for example, if you use a lot of tillage for weed control, that stirs up the soil, adds oxygen to the soil, and actually gives you a little bit more of a nutrient release, at least temporarily. So, and then you can look at the chemistry of the soil or the pH of the soil, and you can find out about that through soil testing. So anyway, think about supply and demand, and you want to ideally try to match them as best as possible. So one way to monitor this is to do a soil test, and there's different kinds of soil tests. There's a standard soil fertility test where you sample the upper 6 inches of the soil, and you should go to the Rutgers website to learn about how to take a soil sample, how to go about it properly. You don't simply take soil from one specific spot, but you want to do a sampling in a fashion that you take cores from maybe 15, 20 cores over the area of interest to be sampled. And if you have very different soils, or you have different field histories, that requires separate soil samples. On most farms, you're going to take far more than a single soil sample. Even in just a homeowner's property, you could have the vegetable garden, which we sampled separately from the lawn and separately from the flower beds and so on, because they have different management and they have different histories. And there are special soil tests also for nitrogen, and in that case, you sample a little bit deeper. So here's a soil test report from the Rutgers lab. You can get a soil test done for a single sample for $20. It's money well spent. It would take much time to go into this in great detail, but it classifies the nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, into the relative supply. Ideally, what you're trying to achieve is to get these nutrient levels in the optimum range and keep them there. And the Rutgers lab will also provide you with specific recommendations based on the findings from your report. It also tests for a series of micronutrients shown down below. And then a really critical factor is soil pH. And this is one of the most fundamental properties of the soil. I mean, there are different crops that have different pH preferences. There are the acid-loving crops like cranberry and azalea and blueberry that like pHs around 4.8 to 5 and so on. And then there are crops like asparagus that want a pH about 6.8, or alfalfa 6.8. And then for most vegetables, not all, but many vegetables, the optimum soil pH is about 6.5. And it's a very important factor. And you use limestone to adjust soil pH. And you should carefully select the liming material based on what the soil test report shows. Like if the soil is very high in calcium but low in magnesium, then you want to use a high magnesium limestone. And if the reverse is the case, it's low in calcium but high in magnesium, then you want to use a high calcium limestone. So here's a farmer spreading limestone on the soil. And so acidity is associated with hydrogen ions and aluminum in the soil. Aluminum can be toxic. And then this limestone does, it adds lots of calcium and magnesium. It neutralizes the acidity and puts a lot of calcium and magnesium on the colloids and gets rid of those toxic elements. So the other thing that it does, it goes beyond plant nutrition, especially the calcium effect. One of the things that calcium does, it improves the crumb structure of the soil. It makes nice little soil beds, or it helps to flocculate. It brings soil particles together and helps it, like a very clay soil, behave a bit more like a sandy soil, or it makes it more of a loamy kind of soil. So it's very important to soil structure. It's not just about plant nutrition, but calcium is an important essential plant nutrient. Just using one particular crop to illustrate the response that might be expected to liming. This is a study done in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, and the initial soil pH was 5.5. To grow a nice hay crop with red clover, we'd like to get the pH up to about 6.5 to 6.8. And it just shows that there was a nice benefit, an economic response to the application of limestone. We got an increase in hay yield and so on. But the other thing I mentioned here is we used a couple of compared different types of limestone. We looked also at calcium silicate. And this reminds me to say a little bit about plant health and mineral nutrition. There's a really good book, Mineral Nutrition of Plant Disease, and give you a lot of ideas about how to use and optimize every plant mineral nutrient in such a way that it makes the plants healthier and it decreases the need to use pesticides, and maybe eliminate them in some cases, the need to use pesticides. And the more you know about this, then the more good it's going to do to save your farm money, to have healthier crops. This is all related to soil health. And like I showed in that previous figure, we could use calcium silicate, which supplies silicon, and it suppresses powdery mildew disease. Did a lot of research on this. It really works. And the nice thing about it, it works, and it works year after year after year after year. I'm not saying it will completely prevent powdery mildew disease, but it will at least greatly reduce the onset of the disease, and maybe you won't ever have to use fungicides. And fungicides, they're effective for a time, but then eventually the disease organism builds up a resistance to that pesticide. But good plant nutrition works in a very, very sustainable way. So you can learn a lot about it from that book. Consider getting your soil tested for heavy metals. I mentioned that Cornell has a soil health assessment test for $75. You can look into that if you want to learn more about it. But I think there's a lot you can do just to learn about soil health. from observing your own soil. One really effective way to build soil health quickly is to use compost. And it's a great addition to the soil, but do be cautious not to use it repeatedly in high amounts because it can lead to nutrient imbalances. But as a way to jumpstart soil health, it's really one of the best ways you can go about it. Besides using compost directly, such as composting shade tree leaves and manures and so on. In this case, I'm going to illustrate how you could use shade tree leaves very effectively as a mulch to suppress weeds, and then at the same time feeding the soil, benefiting soil health, and protecting soil from erosion. We found that it worked very well as a mulch to protect the soil from weeds and soil erosion. One of the things that shade tree leaves, though, can do is lead to nutrient nitrogen deficiency. The first year, you don't get much nitrogen out of it. It's really the second year. So you have to work it into a really good crop rotation. We just published an article about this, a review article based on 30 years of research in New Jersey. Happy to send it to you or bring it to your attention if you're interested in learning more how to use shade tree leaves or community shade tree leaves. We have an abundance of this free resource in New Jersey. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is to get to know and understand the nitrogen cycle and avoid the need to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which are very expensive. If you manage the nitrogen cycle very well, it's solar powered, it doesn't use fossil fuel energy, and it means good crop rotations, it means animal integration, it means composting and so on to supply nitrogen, which is freely available from the atmosphere through biological nitrogen fixation. So the other thing I want to recommend that you do to build soil health is learn how to grow cover crops. There's many different types of cover crops. There's a really good book on it here from the USDA SARA program. One cover crop that I particularly like is sun hemp. It's a summer cover crop. Here it is used, still see some of the residue when I used it to grow in the following year, sweet potatoes. Here's a farmer in Pennsylvania, an organic farmer from this farm's called the Family Cow, or Edwin Shank. And he's very, very enthusiastic about cover crops and grows a cocktail of cover crops, not just a single type of cover crop, but a whole blend of different seeds, sunflowers and sun hemp and sorghum Sudan grass. And he writes about how he's very, very thrilled about it, very poetic. And he talks about, how it makes the earthworms sing. So there you see. So just look at that thick layer of rotting compost and organic matter. You can almost hear the earthworms singing. So there they are, ending the cover crop. It's the way to feed the soil and build soil organic matter content. And the other thing that I argue is that pasture isn't of itself a kind of cover crop. And in this study here, which you can read about in my newsletter, the soil profile, that you can take a degraded soil and in about a half a decade, for about 5 years, you can almost double the organic matter content. So, and at the same time, you're feeding livestock. So it's not just a cover crop, it's both a cover crop, it's no-till. You can park that plow and have a very, very sustainable system. And to try to finish up here now, I want to urge you to consider ways to eliminate the use of pesticides, use plant nutrition, to enhance soil health, enhance crop health, and minimize or eliminate the use of pesticides, especially glyphosate, which does bad things to the soil. It is a chelator, it ties up micronutrients, and it does not do good for the soil biology. Here's another thing, is one of my pet peeves about managing soil, is keep plastic waste out of the soil. Maybe you're not going to be a hay farmer, but I encourage hay farmers to get away from using plastic string and instead use natural sisal string. It's a renewable resource. It's something that we grow in agriculture, and we don't need to use this polystring, which leaves residues of plastic in the soil. And we're finding out that plastic has damaging properties to water infiltration. It negatively affects the physical condition of the soil, and it's very unsightly, and it gets caught up in your tillage equipment and so on. So there's some tips on things to avoid.
Thank you, Dr. Heckman.
Now, so you can read through this yourself, but I'm a big fan of what I call doing whatever you can to produce foods of exceptional quality. Try to be an artisan farmer and get into direct marketing. And then here's my last slide, and here's my summary. And they say I'm out of time, so you can read.
Yeah,
through
the
this.
class is ending in 3 minutes, and we need to finish up our assignments.
Okay, I'm done.
Yep.
So you can read that on your own. That's my summary.
Yep. Thanks. And we also, Dr. Heckman gave us a lot of good resources that are in the Canvas module for you. So there's a lot of great information there. So thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.